At this point, based on the previous section, I'm going to take it that you have a working understanding of Bandura's theory of moral disengagement. The question now, of course, is why should we accept that theory? Now, just here I want to pause because many of you taking this course are coming from philosophical backgrounds. Not everybody, so if you're not from a philosophy background, I think this question will be quite natural to you. But much of philosophy is actually just a matter of storytelling. So once you've told the story, you're kind of done, right? So at this point, it's very natural for philosophers to stop. We have a nice story about moral disengagement, kind of see like, there's some case to be said for, I can sort of see how that might happen. Maybe I've done it myself. Okay, we're done, right? That's the end of the philosophy. Now, I've got nothing against philosophy. Indeed, I think storytelling is super important. I think storytelling has contributed enormously to progress in all kinds of ways. But I also think that it's often possible to go beyond storytelling. And certainly, and here's the key thing if you're coming at this from a narrowly philosophical background, you can't do moral psychology just by storytelling. In moral psychology, we're asking a question about humans' ethical abilities. We can't come to gain knowledge of those ethical abilities just through a process of storytelling. We need more. We need to be able to distinguish between different stories that provide us with compelling evidence or weak evidence, predictions that are supported or that are not supported. But in the case of a theory like Bandura's, now we're in the realms of social psychology, it's very difficult to understand what kind of evidence might support that theory. We're not going to get neat and simple predictions. So what Bandura and his colleagues did was to develop a moral disengagement questionnaire. So they had the 8 processes of moral disengagement, and they developed a questionnaire that tried to tap into those different processes. So they gave the questionnaire to a whole variety of people. It's been used several times. And the questions were always, to what extent would you agree that it's all right to beat someone who badmouths your family, for example? So that would be indicating how prone you are to moral justification, one aspect of that. Or they might say, to what extent would you agree that it's okay to tell small lies because they don't really do any harm? The more strongly you agree with that, the more it's taken that you might be distorting consequences, or at least that's the idea, that's the hope. Some people deserve to be treated like animals. The more you agree with that, that's another sign of this dehumanization, which is a form of moral disengagement. Kids who get mistreated usually do things to deserve it. It's quite dark stuff, right? It's quite dark. So here's what they did. They have the moral disengagement questionnaire, and that's a questionnaire involving 32 items, 4 for each of the processes. And the thought is something like this. If moral disengagement is a thing, and these 8 processes are really distinct things, then although the 4 items for each of the processes are distinct, statistically we should see that the answers to those tend to hang together, as if the answers were explained by a single factor. And if moral disengagement itself is a thing, we should be able to recover the idea that the overall pattern of answers that you get to all of these items should be ultimately explicable by a single factor, right? So it might be that there are individual or cultural differences in the forms that moral disengagement takes, which processes people lean for. Some people might be more into dehumanization, others more into moral justification, say. But what we should see is that behind all of that, statistically, there should be a single factor that the questionnaire is measuring. What we can do then is use statistical methods that I don't understand. I'm not even going to name them because I'm super ignorant here, to try to identify whether or not there is indeed a single factor underpinning the whole thing. What I can tell you is that statistically, a single factor can be regarded as responsible for subjects' responses on all items. That's what was found in one of the earliest studies on this, the earliest one that I know of actually, the 96 Bandura et al. Paper, and has frequently been found ever since. In fact, as far as I know, there's no study that hasn't found a version of this result. So what's striking about Bandura et al. And most of the other studies is that they don't find much structure. So they don't find much evidence for the idea that there are 8 distinct processes, but they do find good evidence that answers to the questionnaire can be treated as all explained by a single factor, moral disengagement, although some studies have found structure. But they've rarely actually found, interesting, they've rarely found the 8 process structure that Bandura postulates. So this is a good result because it suggests to us that moral disengagement is a genuine factor and that the questionnaire is measuring it. The second thing is that it appears to be useful. So what Bandura and colleagues found is that the factor measured by the questionnaire correlated significantly with antisocial behaviour. So this was a study with 2 different age groups of school children in families who are living in or near Rome in Italy. And so what they're finding is that moral disengagement appears to be correlated with the antisocial behaviour, in particular with bullying. And that's, of course, important because the idea is this factor of moral disengagement is supposed to be exactly the kind of thing, according to Bandura, that would explain just that thing. And there are also some other good hints here. So the fact that the moral disengagement in this study, not all of them, but many others, doesn't relate to socioeconomic factors like income or status is a good thing, because moral disengagement, there's no reason to think that it should do that. Right? So if we did get correlation here, we would then face the question, well, maybe we're not picking up on moral disengagement at all, we're picking up on some social factor, which then explains why the antisocial behaviour occurs. The fact that we're able to explain antisocial behaviour unmediated by these socioeconomic factors suggests that we've got a powerful explanatory tool here. Importantly, there are a wide number of further studies. I've mentioned more of them in the notes below, what I think are the best ones that I could find in the notes below. There are some that seem to me less careful, and I've skipped over those. I just want to mention one now because I think this is particularly interesting. So McAllister and colleagues were doing a longitudinal survey of US citizens. They were doing kind of telephone survey back in the day. And they started doing this. They collected about half of their sample before the September 11th terrorist strikes on New York, and the second half of the sample after that. And interestingly, they were studying the effects of moral disengagement on support for military intervention, where the military intervention was the kind of thing like the war of terror, that was known to cause great civilian casualties, right? So there was never really much doubt that that war would be rather grim from an ethical point of view. So they were interested in relationship between moral disengagement and support for military action by ordinary US citizens. What they found was incredibly interesting. So they found 2 things, I think 2 main things. There's a lot in that paper actually. The first one was that on all measures, moral disengagement increased significantly after the September 11th terrorist strike. So they saw an increase in moral disengagement amongst their participants. And secondly, this is, I think, is quite remarkable, and I'm not 100% sure that I believe this, but I think it's certainly indicative of something important. They found that the increased support for military action after the September 11th strikes was entirely explained by the change in moral disengagement. So they found no evidence at all that the strikes themselves had directly caused people to be more in favour of military action. They thought rather that the strikes had modulated moral disengagement, and it was only through moral disengagement that there was a stronger preference for military action. So that's, I think, a very striking result, and something that tells us something important about how things can happen at the level of whole nations, right? How a nation might actually go to war or be prevented from going to war. And I think you can see from that there are many other potentially interesting applications of the theory. So here's the basic idea. Moral disengagement appears to be both a valid construct and a useful construct. Valid because we have good evidence that we can set out to measure it using a questionnaire and find that the answers are explained, although there are many different questions, by a single factor. And useful because we find that it seems to play a role in explaining some of the things that it ought to explain. Things like bullying or support for military action, where that military action is known to cause innocent people's deaths. So that's a good sign there. I wanted to note very quickly this term construct. So that's actually defined in the glossary below. You're going to come across this term quite a bit. It's a social psychology term, I think. The idea is very simple. I have a theory that seeks to explain a pattern of behaviour, and in order to do that, it postulates something. It postulates something. For example, moral disengagement is the postulate, the construct. And then we go off and we measure whether or not that theoretical construct really can explain that behaviour. So the idea is that we've constructed something in a theory, we think it's real, but we don't know in advance. We call it a construct. I think that's just a good way of reminding ourselves that when we're talking about moral disengagement, we're not talking about something that we know to exist already. Rather, it's something whose existence and explanatory power needs to be investigated and demonstrated. Same thing with things like, moral feelings, or, as we'll come to later, the moral foundations from moral foundations theory. They are also constructs. All right, very good. So that's some terminology. Here's the important thing though. We've seen what moral disengagement is, and we've seen that we've got good evidence to think that it's both a valid construct and a useful one. So that's very promising. But why do we care? Why is this relevant to us at this part of the course on moral psychology?